In a factory in Orange, New Jersey, just over 100 years ago, young women glowed in the dark. They painted the tiny numbers on watch dials with a radium paint that shimmered a soft green. And to keep the bristles sharp, they wet their brushes between their lips. Lip dip paint, hundreds of times a day. They were told the paint was harmless. It was killing them. And the rule that now says your employer can't quietly do the same to you, they wrote it while they were dying. Today, we follow the dial painters the press would later call the Radium Girls, and the long shadow they cast over every workplace you've ever clocked into. We'll trace how a paint that glowed in the dark became one of the first poisons a company was forced, in open court, to answer for. And we'll end somewhere you might not expect, in the gig economy on your phone, where the question these women pried open is being asked all over again. When your work makes you sick, who is responsible? To understand the glow, you have to understand the moment. Radium had been isolated by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, and for a generation, it was treated less like a hazard than a miracle. It went into toothpaste, into face cream, into tonics sold as health. By April 1920, Scientific American counted more than 4 million radium-luminous watches and instruments already made. The dark could now tell time, and the world wanted it. The U.S. Radium Corporation, in Orange, New Jersey, hired young women, many of them teenagers, to paint those dials by hand. The work paid well. It even felt magical. The women left the factory with radium dust in their hair and on their clothes, and on the walk home, they shimmered faintly in the dark. Some painted their nails with it. Some painted their teeth to surprise a sweetheart with a glowing smile. The technique was the trap. To paint a number a millimeter wide, you needed a needle fine point, so the painters were taught to shape the brush with their mouths. Lip dip paint. With every dial, a little radium went in. Here the record turns grim, so let me be careful. We don't know exactly how many women died. Estimates run from dozens to many hundreds across the industry, and full counts were never kept. What we do know is documented. By the early 1920s, the painters began to fall apart. Teeth loosened and fell out. Jaws abscessed and crumbled, a condition doctors named radium jaw. Bones broke under the weight of ordinary movement. The cause is brutally simple. Radium behaves chemically like calcium, so the body files it into the bones, mistaking poison for structure. There it sits, firing alpha particles inward year after year. By one account from Oak Ridge, a dial painter could take in radium at levels thousands of times what was later judged the maximum a body could safely hold. When the women asked, the company reassured them. According to historical accounts, U.S. Radium even suggested, falsely, that their illness was syphilis, a diagnosis that smeared the dying as it silenced them. One of those women was Grace Fryer. Her teeth were gone. Her spine was collapsing. It took her 2 years just to find a lawyer willing to take the case. In May 1927, Fryer and 4 others sued. By their first court appearance, in January 1928, 2 of the women were bedridden, and not one of them could raise her arm high enough to take the oath. This is where a private tragedy becomes a public rule, what we might call the mechanism. Because the company knew. Records held today by the U.S. National Archives show that as early as April 1926, U.S. Radium was quietly paying settlements to sick workers, $1,000 here, several thousand there. Releases signed long before any of this reached a courtroom. Later internal correspondence, also in the archives, shows company officials tracking the women's failing health even as the firm denied the danger in public. What turned suffering into proof was science. A New Jersey medical examiner, Harrison Martland, developed the test that tied the women's ruined bones directly to the radium inside them. Before this, occupational disease was nearly impossible to win in court. Too slow to show, too hard to trace, too easy for an employer to deny. The Radium Girls and the press and reformers who amplified them broke that. Their cases helped establish a principle we now take for granted, that an employer can be held responsible for an illness the work itself causes, and that workers have a right to know what they're being exposed to. In June 1928, Fryer and her co-plaintiff settled. A decade later, in 1938, a dying Catherine Donahue testified against another radium company from what was effectively her deathbed. The consequence chain ran forward from there into state occupational disease laws and eventually, in 1970, into the agency we now call OSHA. So the next time a workplace rule feels obvious, that your employer can't knowingly poison you and walk away, remember, it wasn't always obvious. It was built case by case by women who didn't live to see it. Now, look at how that shadow falls today. The poison has changed shape. A growing share of work is no longer directed by a manager you can see, but by an algorithm, software that sets your pace, your targets, your score. The European Workplace Safety Agency, EU OSHA, reports that around 12% of EU companies already use technology to decide the content or speed of work, and about 8% use it to monitor performance. In the gig economy, the platforms present themselves as neutral middlemen, just an app, while quietly setting the terms through code. I want to be careful here, because the parallel isn't exact. Today's harm is mostly psychological, surveillance, relentless pace, isolation, not radioactive. But the question rhymes with 1928 almost word for word. When the work injures you, who is the employer when the employer is an app? And the literal shadow hasn't faded either. Radium 226 has a half-life of about 1,600 years. The bones of the Radium girls are still radioactive, still tickable on a Geiger counter, a century on. They are, in the most literal sense, still glowing. So here's the open question for the next few decades. As more of us are hired, scheduled, scored, and fired by systems rather than by people, the doctrine these women forced into being may have to be rewritten to name a responsible employer where today there's only an interface. The Radium girls answered, "Who is accountable?" once. We may have to answer it again in code. The women who painted with light were told it was harmless, and in dying, they made it the law that it can't be hidden. That same question, who answers when the work does the harm, is quietly being reopened by the software now running our jobs. If long shadow stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. There's another one on Friday.